Good evening, Dr. Seiler. I'm recording this on my own software because the Kylera software just didn't allow for a screen recording, so I'm using a HyperCam V2, so I apologize for any irregularities on that front. I'll just upload the regular video and we'll see if we can get that to work. But either way, the content will remain the same. So, good evening. Today I picked the first question for the assignment as per why did the Protestant Reformation start? And that's an incredibly complicated question that I think it's a little bit unfair to reduce to a few-minute explanation. But assuming that one can, in a meaningful way, reduce that without a serious academic research into the topic, there are two threads of causes for the Protestant Reformation that I've decided to present in this: theological concerns and political/socioeconomic concerns. Seeing as the political and socioeconomic concerns somewhat came about after the theological concerns, I will do the same chronology in the presentation. The theological concerns with the Protestant Reformation were simply a result of the Catholic Church somewhat losing its way. Over the centuries of the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church became the dominant continent-wide political force. It's the oldest institution in Western civilization. It outlasts every single monarchy that has ever existed in the West and at the time existed. That gave it a large amount of power that secular rulers simply didn't have, and a lot of leverage, because there was always going to be a pope. And with limited exception, it wouldn't be disputed who the pope was. So the pope and his representatives throughout the continent wielded an enormous amount of power. And as is human nature, when given power, they used it for their own benefit. Indulgences, simony, and the use of land provided to the church by secular rulers and grants and donations for ostensibly religious purposes were used for profit. Vicars of the church used their offices for profit, and they misled the lay members of the public and their flock and basically used them for their own gain. And as is probably quite easily predictable, people weren't too pleased by that. No, not at all. They began to resent the landed aristocracy that the priests and vicars had become. And the flashpoint after this prelude of just steadily over the centuries, more and more resentment for the administrators of the Catholic Church, for a faith that basically every Western European, Central European, Northern European, every country had been united in following, was that they refused to change. And like all institutions that have power, it really did not want to give it up, and it viewed any serious discussion of the merits of its practices as an inherent threat and a heresy. And it prosecuted it as such. Jan Hus and the Hussite Crusades, discussed in Chapter 14, Section 1a, were the crystallization of this trend, such that the faithful Catholic that Jan Hus was, and was not really in dispute, had simply different ideas on some theological principles. And from the earliest days of the Catholic Church, disagreement fundamentally influenced the development of the religion. There was never an uncriticized universal view. There is never such in religion. But the Catholic Church, by this point in the 14th century, had begun to view any criticism of what there was agreement on, which was basically using the church to profit themselves and be concerned with worldly matters, viewed it as heresy. There were no less than 4 crusades called against the Catholic faithful Christians of Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, simply because they professed a different faith. And that engendered more resentment. And as is human nature, again, when a boot crushes you into the ground, resentment follows. And even if some people were killed, and Reformation dissuaded for another half century, it started to add a little bit more background temperature to the fuels and fires of medieval Europe. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, and as discussed in the textbook in Chapter 14, Section 2, along with his biography and general history, were really a sophisticated summation of all the griefs and gripes that many people had with the Catholic Church. Brought up the indulgences, simony, the abuse of church land, the abuse of church offices. And it is worth noting that of all the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, these were all monks. These were all learned in Catholic tradition and faithful members of the Catholic Church, leaders of the Catholic Church in their communities. That's some important context for the treatment they got from the Church. At the Diet of Worms, convened by the Holy Roman Emperor, Martin Luther was basically as close as one can come to be excommunicated without being excommunicated. His works were deemed heretical, probably put on the index of prohibited books, which in of itself is a laughable concept, and in whole rejected. And that's when the Catholic Church really lost control of the narrative and ceded it to the Protestants, because being able to engage in a discourse, a give and take, would have probably moderated their concerns a great deal. Because these were not inherently violent people or people who wanted power for themselves. They wanted change, not just for change's sake, but to make the religion, to more easily spread the religion, to convert more faithful, to save more people as they would have viewed it, to bring more into God's grace. But that was frustrated by the Pope, by the Holy Roman Emperor, by pretty much every Catholic landed authority, King of Spain, King of France for a long time. And John Calvin's exile from France to Geneva, as discussed in Chapter 14, Section 3, and the general, just violent repression of the Huguenots in France, furthermore drove a wedge between anyone who was Catholic or Lutheran, Reformed, Calvinist, what have you. It became more than just an arbitrary distinction. It became an identity. It became an identity people were willing to die for and kill over. So, in the end of this left Europe in a state of flux. The peasants were almost as if the light of change, and reform is in the name of the Reformation. It was inherently opposed, even if Martin Luther supported the social order, it was opposed to how things were, and it was a promise of a different way. And being a serf, a landed serf in medieval Europe, you could probably see the allure of this way of thinking, even if you couldn't quite understand the theological implications, which itself was being fixed by Martin Luther's spreading of education, translation of the Bible into German, and the greater ability of lay members of church to understand the religion rather than just having it being told to them and them taking on the good word. This kind of led the peasants to, where available and where they weren't going to be killed for it, and sometimes where they were even still, to support the Protestant Reformation. Secular rulers, as will be discussed and furthered on in a moment, started to leverage this driving of a wedge between the Catholic and the Protestants. And this in of itself widened the edge. They would play each side off of each other, and especially in the Holy Roman Empire. This is most prominent in the Holy Roman Empire, where princes and electors would switch faiths as was politically expedient. So this left Europe in a state of flux. People were very distrustful. Of course, this was not of the scale and magnitude of the Great Schism of 1054 between the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Church, because they were all still in the same continent. They still agreed on 80% of the same religion. And they had been killing each other for the past few years, but so had most of the continent. But what really drew the Protestant identity and crystallized it and separated it irrevocably to this day from the Catholic identity was the political and socioeconomic concerns. The prelude to this, as discussed, with the theological concerns. But the flashpoint was when the interests of the Catholic Church started to conflict with the interests of the peasants and the interests of the rulers. The peasant interest was obviously to improve their lives, and the Church, as working hand in hand in the Holy Roman Empire with the Holy Roman Emperor. Keep in mind, the Holy Roman Emperor, still at this time, was crowned and chosen by the Pope. So you can understand that these two institutions were very closely tied. They were somewhat symbiotic. The Holy Roman Emperor provided the temporal authority that the Pope needed to make his demands and to get what he wanted done, basically. So the German peasants, those that had keenly remembered what occurred to Martin Luther's followers, to John Calvin's followers, they were scared. But when you're faced with as Hobbes would say, a nasty, brutish, and short life in which you had no freedom to believe how you chose, no freedom to live where you wanted, and just to die working another man's land, risks become somewhat less relevant. So when the German peasants revolt, they hedged their odds, and they rose up. And this widespread put down and massacring of people of the same nation, people of the same faith, who spoke the same language, drove a wedge right in between what was once nominally one nation, even if the Holy Roman Empire was by nature disunited. And the French wars of religion were this on a much more grandiose scale. There were hundreds of thousands of people massacred and discriminated against in France. And the monarchy, since it was basically weakened to almost vacancy by this, it was mostly peasants. It was peasants fighting other peasants, which is kind of a hard idea to grasp your head around at the core of it, because these were brothers. These were fraternal brothers. And yet these religions, these differences on theology that only seem to matter to us on Sundays, were, as said before, matters to die for and kill over, which really drew a wedge between the identity of a Protestant and the identity of a Catholic. These two identities were no longer, as they once were in Martin Luther's day, they were no longer compatible. You were one, the other, or neither. You could not be both. No compromise could be broached, as we will learn with Thomas More and Henry VIII. Henry VIII kind of crystallizes, I know I use that term a lot, but it's very useful for what I'm trying to do here. How do I say this? He presents the most crystallized argument for the political influence on the Protestant Reformation. The King of England had always been Catholic since William the Conqueror's day. They were Catholics born and bred. They had very little theological difference with the Catholic Church. Within the average bounds, there were no serious sectarian conflicts in England prior to this. They were fairly, as close as one could get in the medieval age, a pretty homogeneous religious nation. But Henry VIII, important context, wanted a divorce. And as is still frowned upon in modern day, but was much back then a much more serious matter, only the Pope could annul a marriage. Divorce was very much taboo. Seeing as marriage was a sacrament, it was pretty close to a sin. So Henry VIII seeked to get his marriage with Catherine of Aragon annulled, as the story has often been told, so as to produce a male heir. And the Pope said nope. And Henry VIII, in his infinite wisdom, said, okay, I'll start my own church and annul my own marriage, because I'm the king and I get to do what I want. And that idea, that I am the king and I get to do what I want, is also evocative of another concept that's coming into fruition right around the same time historically. As with the erosion of the feudal power structure discussed in the last unit, monarchs were becoming very powerful. They were second to none in their nation prior to this except for one. In religious matters, all men, be they the king or the peasant, were subject to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and the Vicar of Christ. Henry VIII proved that a ruler could, with great consequence and great exertion, as would be later shown through the various conflicts between the Jacobites and the Protestants of England, could separate and could defy the Pope. And this was an incredibly earth-shattering development. There was a time when the Pope had more power than many monarchs of Europe. But now he was unable, other than feudally declaring Henry VIII excommunicated, and any man who cooperated with him excommunicated, he was unable to really stop it in a meaningful way. But since the idea of absolute monarchy was kind of hand in hand with this, it further crystallized the identity of Protestants and left no room for compromise. As Henry VIII's faithful minister Thomas More learned, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you were either loyal to your king or to your pope. And if you were loyal to the pope, you were viewed with suspicion as a papist, as if you were loyal to him above your nation. And that was certainly disqualifying from high office, but for a paranoid man like Henry VIII certainly was, it got Sir Thomas More killed. And that really kind of brought us to the next period in European history, is nations that, for various medleys of reasons, be they theological, political, socioeconomic, identified as Protestant or Catholic, waged these vicious wars against each other that really set in and kept digging and digging and digging these lines between these nations that only scant 2 centuries before had all been in communion. It was very similar to, as said before, the Great Schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. In summation, the Protestant Reformation can best be described as being caused by a summation of factors that ultimately were the fault of problem with the established authority for a variety of reasons. But they represented an insurrection against the old way, the established way. Be they because the old way was wrong or because the old way was not benefiting you, there were either the sycophants of the old way or the people who wanted to overthrow it. And that lack of ability for compromise, seeing as this was not really something that was discussed in kind and quiet circles, but more rather with crucifixions and executions and crusades, really exacerbated what could have been a doctrinal dispute into the Protestant Reformation. So yeah, I apologize for any issues with audio quality or bugs or things that might have come up on the screen. I'm sure that's not anything new for people who are doing this the first time like I am. Thank you very much.